Coming up on the show, Julie joins us from the Global Space Technology Convention and Exhibition at the SANS Expo and Convention Center.
As global security becomes more complex, space is emerging as a central player in military operations. We'll explore the growing overlap between commercial and defense section and the opportunities and risks posed by dual-use technologies with Victoria Samson. She's a director from the Secure World Foundation.
As global security becomes increasingly complex, space is taking on a central role in military operations. From intelligence and surveillance to secure communications and navigation, the lines between commercial and defense sectors are blurring, making it essential to explore the implications that dual-use technologies offer. Well, this is one of the key topics being discussed at the GSTCE here in Singapore, where our very own Julie Yoo is standing by with a guest. Julie, what do you have for us?
Yeah, Ella, thank you very much. You know, the future of space may become a battleground, raising questions about collaboration and regulation. And for more on the growing space security concerns and the dual-use nature of space technologies, I'm joined by Victoria Samson. She's the Chief Director of Space Security and Stability for the Secure World Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us, Victoria.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you know what? With increasing tensions over space assets and technologies, and given the geopolitical environment we are in, what's your assessment of the security of space these days? Is space already a war zone?
Not a war zone necessarily, but what we're seeing is a proliferation of what we call counterspace capabilities. That is to say, some sort of technology that could interfere with the ability to utilize space, whether it's destructive, non-destructive, permanent, irreversible, things like that. And so we're seeing a lot more research and development being done into those kind of capabilities. Now, the destructive kinds are not being used in war zones, but something like GPS jamming happening constantly. We're seeing what they call co-orbital, getting up into space and getting near your satellite you're interested in, and whether they're going to interfere with it, jam it. We're seeing a lot of that sort of thing. So I think we're at a point where there's a possibility of inadvertent escalation, where you have geopolitical complication on the ground from reimagining itself in orbit.
I love that. So all these technologies are getting a bit more sophisticated, getting more serious, as you mentioned. Is there a particular technology that worries you the most when considering the military applications or the potential for conflict?
Right. I think my concern is that it's not going to be the obvious ones. You know, like an interceptor that goes up and hits another satellite and blows it up. We have seen that done. 4 countries have done that sort of test: the United States, Russia, China, and India. But generally speaking, creating debris on orbit is bad. You know, we can't really see all of it. It can really damage other satellites. It complicates the space environment a lot. What I'm concerned about is you might have a situation where another country's satellite is getting up close to another country's satellite. And you don't know necessarily what they're planning on doing. You don't know if they're just taking pictures, if they're trying to hear what you're listening to, if they're going to try and jam so that you can't broadcast your signal, or if they're going to even physically interfere with that. And so what I worry about is if you have a time of tension on the ground and you have an unclear situation happening in orbit, you may have conflict in space lead to conflict on Earth.
I wonder, what do you think about the private companies like SpaceX being involved in geopolitical conflicts, as we've seen in the ongoing war in Ukraine?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think the commercial sector has always been involved in space, and they've always been involved in military space from the very beginning, but it's just much more obvious now. You know, when you have, as you said, you have Starlink providing communication services to Ukrainian military. You have both the Ukrainians and the Russians using GPS coordination to target things. You have Earth observation companies, that is to say companies with satellites that look down on Earth and take pictures. They're using their information, their imagery for monitoring troop movements and things like that. So it's much more prevalent. And there's a concern that, as these commercial actors get more embroiled in military circumstances, they could be considered what's called lawful targets themselves. And that doesn't mean necessarily just because you're a lawful target doesn't mean you can immediately shoot them. There's all sorts of, the legal things principles you have to follow. But I mean, it's becoming more and more embroiled. And it's interesting because a company like SpaceX, officially they're a U.S. company. And according to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, countries are responsible for their national activities in space in the grand scheme of things. And so I could see a circumstance where it's possible that Starlink could get involved in something that would drag the United States into the discussion as well, particularly given how close SpaceX's CEO, Elon Musk, has gotten to the United States new president.
So with no clear guidelines, it looks like we are treading into sort of a gray area here. And speaking of which, as more countries and private companies are vying for space, the ownership question, who owns the moon now that we have found water and resources? I mean, do you think space is on track to become the new Wild West?
I think, there are some legal foundations there, right? Officially you can't what's called appropriate orbit. You can't appropriate celestial bodies, things like that. But you can share them, right? And so I think what we have a possibility of seeing as more countries and companies are going to the moon, they have similar interests. Everyone wants to go towards the South Pole because that's where it is thought that there's ice. And if you have ice, you have water you could use for fuel, you can use it for human habitation, things like that. And so there's circumstances where you can see, well, if the U.S. and China both want to go to the same spots, how do you decide? And so the United Nations and other organizations are starting to think about that. How do you coordinate these sort of activities? But it is very complicated. And particularly as you have companies going to the moon, I mean, previously the only actors on the moon were countries, right? And so you have companies going and saying, okay, for example, last year we had a U.S. company that was going to be bringing cremains, cremated human remains to the moon. And we're like at the point, just because someone's willing to pay you for this, should you allow it? And the governance is having a hard time keeping up with this sort of thing.
And the law as well, law and regulations clearly had a lot of catching up to do with reality to prevent chaos and conflict. How far along are we in addressing that gap? And do you think we are moving fast enough?
Well, I mean, so internationally they're having their own discussions, but really what it comes down to is national regulation and licensing. So, for example, it's called mission authorization in the United States, and they're trying to figure out how do they get to that point. Technology usually gets out ahead of the law, and so that's not unusual for space. But just because the consequences could be so high from geopolitical circumstance, I think it really is important to do that. And other countries, I would say, are less, they're earlier in their path of thinking about these sort of things than the United States is.
Okay. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there for now, but what a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right. I've been speaking with Victoria Samson, the Chief Director, Space Security and Stability at the Secure World Foundation. And that wraps up day one of GSTCE. Our coverage continues tomorrow with a focus on the synergy between space technology and sustainability, along with discussion on what it takes to finance ambitious space ventures. Back to you, Ella.
Oh, absolutely fascinating to hear that as well. Thank you so much, Julie, for all the lives that you've been doing for us.